Welcome to the What If It's Not Depression podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Achina Stein. Today, we are going to be talking about 5G and EMFs. And I have an expert in the field who's going to talk about all of the scientific literature that he knows about it, how it affects mental health, and solutions. That's going to be the key point. So stay tuned. I want to tell you a little bit about him. His name is R. Blank, and he's an entrepreneur, technologist, and author. He is the CEO of Shield Your Body, which creates products that make it easy and affordable for people to reduce their exposure to wireless radiation and from devices like cell phones and laptops. And along with his father, Dr. Martin Blank, he co-authored Overpowered. It's a book called Overpowered. Isn't that a great name? Widely regarded as one of the best books written on the science and health effects of EMF radiation. He has served on the faculty as an affiliate at the University of California, Santa Cruz in the Digital Arts and New Media program, and previously was on the faculty of the University of Southern California for Viterbi School of Engineering. That's a difficult word. He's authored numerous articles, videos, courses, and books in technology and software development. Welcome, R.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Hey, and everybody, if you love this episode, please click the like button and subscribe. So let's dive in. I love your name. And like I said before, we have to have coffee. And I love the history of names. I love the history of tattoos. I love the history of people in general. But yeah, that is the most intriguing. And so we're just going to keep everybody just guessing on that because we have only time to discuss EMF and 5G.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so I know that your father started this company.
No. So I started the company. My father was a scientist, researcher, and professor at Columbia University Medical School for over 30 years. And in the course of his work, he discovered some surprising impacts of EMF exposure on cellular function, and it intrigued him. So he then ended up spending years investigating this subject, and then actually becoming very involved on the activist side of things, testifying before various commissions and submitting testimony to Parliament and so forth, and serving as an author of the Bioinitiative report, which we can talk about later as well. So that is the work that he did, was purely academic, scientific, and organizational. And then I, in 2012, helped him write Overpowered. Mm-hmm. And it was in the course of writing that book that I really started to understand these issues much more than I had just while growing up around him. And that's when I came up with the idea of what became Shield Your Body. So the book was in 2012, and my first product was in 2013. And it was still kind of a side project for a few years. And then I decided to go focus on it full time in 2016.
Awesome. Thank you for your father.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he probably didn't even imagine all of how much it exploded. It didn't even imagine that happening with the cell towers and right?
Yeah, I mean, he was I guess he thought it was all very irresponsible and sort of crazy how regulatory authorities and industry have just been ignoring the science for so long. I mean, the science keeps growing, but the science on this topic specifically is now over 100 years old. So that's when the initial studies were performed that started to show these biological impacts. So let me just step back 1 second and give a super quick introduction to what EMF is for those who haven't heard the term. EMF stands for electromagnetic field, also sometimes known as electromagnetic radiation, and it's a form of energy created by a combination of electrical and magnetic forces. And there are certain forms of EMF that are natural, and these include sunlight. Sunlight is a natural form of EMF that all life on Earth evolved over billions of years to thrive with. Then there's certain very high energy forms of EMF, and these include things like X-rays and gamma rays. And they have so much energy that everyone universally accepts that this is super harmful, even in very, very, very low doses, which is why you're supposed to get as few X-rays as possible, and why nuclear power plants are dangerous. So then there's a set of EMF with less energy than sunlight, than visible light. And these are the forms that are emitted by all modern technology. That is anything that communicates wirelessly and anything that runs on power. And it was long believed, I'm talking hundreds of years, it was believed and assumed that these forms of EMF were biologically inert or benign, that they did not harm humans or any form of life. And in fact, that's what my father, who became very well known as a scientist and proponent of EMF and health, that's what he was taught, and that's what he was teaching at Columbia Medical School until the 1980s. And that's when he kind of stumbled onto this research showing that those assumptions were incorrect, that even very, very, very low levels of exposure to these forces is bioactive, has negative biological consequences. So I apologize for cutting you off there, but just as a kind of intro to the topic for your listeners.
No, that was perfect. That was perfect segue into that. And a question comes up often, which would be great to answer right now, is where does PEMF land on that spectrum? Because people think, well, isn't that dangerous too? How can you use it for healing?
Sure. So PEMF is pulsed EMF, and so it's about the. I hesitate to use the term frequency because that also means something else, but it's how it's the pulse rate of the radiation, and PEMF can be used for therapeutic applications. There are actual multiple ways of using EMF for therapeutic applications. These all involve precisely calibrated doses, right? And the way, because there's a whole bunch of people out there, notably the cell phone industry, the power industry, the electric power industry, that say there's it's inconclusive evidence that EMF impacts life. But then you see doctors actually using EMF to impact life, and it's a sign that these forces are bioactive because they can be used to heal. But again, that has to be in very precisely calibrated doses. When we're talking about stuff we're getting from cell phones and Wi-Fi networks and power lines and our refrigerators, and these are not precisely calibrated doses. In many cases, they're not even regulated doses, and that's where the harm comes from.
Right. So the dose, is it the frequency of the dose? Is it the amount of time?
Yeah, so it's both. It's both. Frequency, I think I understood your question, but just to clarify, the different types of EMF are actually measured by frequency. And I know that's not what you meant right there. Right. So I just want to, and frequency is measured in hertz.
Right.
And so, for instance, your Wi-Fi router might be running at 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz. And so I'm just trying to relate this to numbers and terms that your listeners will have already heard because they know what their Wi-Fi router is.
Right.
Now, so the different forms of EMF are determined by what the frequency of the EMF is. And that's also that's synonymous or interchangeable with the term energy. Now, in addition to the frequency, there's the power level.
Right.
And so you can have something that's 2.4 gigahertz that's very low powered. You can have something that's 2.4 gigahertz that's very high powered. So the power level there is a dose response relationship between the power level and the likelihood of realizing negative health outcomes. And then also to your question, there is a dose response relationship to cumulative exposures.
Right.
So being exposed to a force for 1 minute is going to be have a very different risk profile than being exposed to that same force for a year or 5 days a week for 20 years or whatever it might be. So dose response, the science does demonstrate a dose response relationship both to the power level and to the cumulative exposure.
Right, right. And it's coming from multiple sources
Yes.
as well, right?
I mean, and more of them all the time. So, and it's important because it can be a little hard for people I know to kind of visualize this. But for someone my age, if I think back to when I was, let's say 8 or 10, and I'm looking around my bedroom, uh, the only real source of EMF in my bedroom would have been the light and the wiring in the walls.
Mm,
There was no Wi-Fi router. We didn't have a cordless phone. I didn't have a cell phone. There were no cell towers in my area. None of that. You go fast forward 10 years, the profile starts changing. You fast forward another 10 years, the profile starts changing. And now you fast forward to 2023, and you are talking about exposures that children today are growing up to exposures that are orders of magnitude larger than when I was growing up. By
mm.
some estimates, one actual conservative estimate, walking down the street in a city today exposes you to over 1 trillion times the amount of EMF that would otherwise be found in a state of nature. And
Right.
that is a conservative estimate. And that estimate is actually several years old at this point. But I state it just to give people some sense of the scale of growth. And so every year there are more towers being built. Every year we see more of our neighbors have Wi-Fi networks. And then in recent years, now people don't have just one Wi-Fi network because they've started deploying these dual network routers. So when you put a router in your house, you actually have two networks running. And then you got the tablets, which people didn't really have 10 years ago. You have refrigerators now are smart. Everything, locks are smart, thermostats are smart. These are all adding to our cumulative exposures. And so, yeah, it's a lot, and it keeps growing.
Right. I really like the way you gave a visual of when you were growing up. But I think it might be even helpful to give, I mean, you just did a little bit, but a visual of every little thing in your home. The Nest, anything that's called smart,
Yeah.
your wireless, even your wireless keyboard and wireless mouse, anything that's wireless, anything that's Bluetooth, right?
Yeah. These are the
It,
ones that are generally exploding in use and popularity. Because power lines and electrical wiring and appliances, these are also sources of EMF, but those don't. Uh, I shouldn't say, because there is a switch increasingly to electricity-based technology instead of, for instance, with cars. We are switching from conventional engines to electric. But in general, the real explosion in deployment of these technologies and our exposures is on the wireless side, like you're saying, anything that is smart. And these use a form of EMF that is called, it can go by both names, radio frequency, because it was used for radio, or microwave. And the reason I point that out is because this is literally how microwave ovens work, is by exposing, you put something in the oven and you turn it on and you expose your food to these microwave rays and it cooks your food. Now, those are much higher levels of power than a cell phone, but it is the same type of radiation as a cell phone.
mm, wow. Yeah. And it's interesting. I know that I'm sensitive to some degree because I used to wear a Fitbit on my wrist and I just could feel the warmth around it and it just wasn't comfortable. And I know that when I put stuff in the microwave, I intuitively know to walk away from it. If
Yeah.
I'm just heating up my coffee for 30 seconds, it's like I can't be near the microwave, as it's happening. So I always walk out of the kitchen and wait for it to beep and then come back and get it. And we try really hard not to use the microwave, and try to switch to a lot of corded kinds of things.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
the heating effect that you just described from wearing your Fitbit, I just want to emphasize to your listeners, that is not imaginary, right? So, in fact, just like we were talking with microwave ovens,
mhm,
there is something called the thermal effect of EMF.
mhm,
And so, if there is enough EMF, so let me step back one step. Enough EMF can heat and cook tissue. That's exactly how a microwave oven works. There's enough of this EMF, enough power to actually cook your food. Um, you can heat tissue at a much lower level of power than what a microwave oven does. And so it is universally acknowledged that EMF can trigger what is called the thermal effect. If you are experiencing the thermal effect, you are experiencing immediate term damage to your body and your health. In fact, all of the regulations that do exist on EMF are based around the thermal effect, meaning it's making sure that you shouldn't be experiencing the thermal effect. So if you are being exposed to EMF and you feel like it is heating you up, it is doing immediate term damage to your body and your health,
mhm.
in a way that regulations are supposed to protect you from, but for a variety of reasons often do not.
Right, right. But not everyone experiences that. And so then they think, oh, well, maybe you're sensitive, but I'm not. The thing is, there's a threshold, right? At some point, and you might not necessarily experience that warm sensation, but there might be still damage going on and affecting
Yes.
you in other ways, which happen to be ways in which you're more vulnerable.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, no. So, I mean, that's a really good point. The reason I highlighted the thermal effect is again to show you how universally accepted science. That is not a controversial statement, right? Every doctor, every scientist would tell you the same thing. So it's to show that there is universal acceptance of the presence of risk from these forces. Now, the difference is at what level of power people are worried or concerned. Now, you talk about sensitivities that might not lead you to feel heating. Um, and there are a lot of them. And so there's a condition, you and I were chatting before the show.
Mhm.
There's a condition called electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS. It is sometimes a controversial topic because
Mhm.
it manifests as a wide range of symptoms, and there are very few protocols for diagnosing this. Now there are some hospitals. We list them on our website. The one I always remember is the Women's College of Toronto in Canada. They have a diagnosis and a treatment protocol. It is actually in the Medicare billing codes in the United States, which means that there is literally a billing code that your doctor can fill out to say that you are experiencing this. In Sweden, it is recognized as a disability. And so it is growing in realization and acceptance, but it is also still somewhat controversial because there's no real way to test for it, no accepted way to test for it yet. But this can manifest as rash, it can manifest as joint pain, it can manifest as anxiety or migraine headaches. And there are varying degrees of severity of the experience. So someone could walk into a room. So I can walk into a room and feel nothing. Someone else would walk into the room and maybe start feeling a little pain. A third person with more severe EHS could walk into the room and feel an unbearable experience and have to leave.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
I
and
know somebody who has serious symptoms of nausea, vomiting, tinnitus, headaches. Basically, as soon as she comes near it, and so
yeah.
yeah, you're right that there are varying degrees of symptoms, and unfortunately, what happens is that rather than doing an investigation of root causes, and a lot of these symptoms that we just mentioned can be caused by multiple things, not
Hmm.
just one thing, not just EMFs, mold, Lyme's disease, increased
But
gut.
these also, yeah, those two specifically will also increase your likelihood of suffering EHS. So if you have mold exposure or you have a history of Lyme disease or heavy metal poisoning or MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity, all of these are factors in how likely you are to have EHS.
Right, right. Just like multiple chemical sensitivities can, point to that direction,
Yeah.
looking in that direction for sure, because it looks at the severity of these symptoms. Yeah, it's almost like the most severe diagnosis you can have when you've broken down all those barriers to even keep the EMFs out. I guess.
Yeah.
Right?
No, yeah, someone visualized it this way for me and I forget how, but like there's a bucket and it can only hold so many toxins. And once you're exposed to enough, it starts overflowing. And
Right.
all of our buckets are different. All of the toxins we're exposed to are different. So the point in time at which it starts overflowing and we can't handle it anymore, it'll be different for everybody else. But that we are exposed to so many different toxins in the world today that it's not just one that's the trigger. It's always going to be some kind of concert of toxic forces that are impacting our health.
Right, right. And are there other symptoms that you know of besides anxiety that people can have on a mental health perspective?
Well, anxiety and depression are the when it comes to EMF in particular, anxiety and depression are the two that I have read most about.
Hmm.
And I guess a related one is sleep disruption, sleep disorders, and insomnia. So I don't know if you consider that a mental health issue or a factor behind mental health issues, but that is also well established. So with the anxiety and depression side, that is very well researched on the power line frequencies, meaning right the stuff that comes off of power lines, electrical wiring, more so than on the radio frequencies, which is the stuff that cell phones and Wi-Fi.
Hmm.
And there are numerous studies linking these power line exposures to increased rates of anxiety, depression, and unfortunately, suicide as well.
Oh, wow.
But when it comes to sleep disruption, there are multiple studies on EMF's impact on the endocrine system. And when I say EMF in this context, I'm also including cell phones. So not just the power line side, but cell phones and Wi-Fi and so forth, demonstrating multiple ways in which these exposures are negatively impacting our endocrine system function. That includes melatonin production,
Hmm.
which obviously helps regulate our circadian rhythm and the quality of our sleep. Blue light is a form of EMF, and that is a form of EMF that is, I'd say at this point, almost universally acknowledged to disrupt sleep.
Hmm.
And the reason I mention it is because a disrupted sleep makes us much more vulnerable to other mental health issues, whether it's anxiety, depression, or whatever else we might be experiencing, because we need good sleep in order for our body. I mean, I know you know this, but for your listeners, you
Sure.
need good sleep just in order for your body to repair itself, to take care of itself, and to energize yourself for the next day. So this is a key mechanism that is very, very well demonstrated by the science.
Awesome. Yeah. That's great. That's great that you were able to parse all of that out in different sections like that.
By the way, I just wanted to jump back to something else you said a couple minutes ago about tinnitus. That is another area where there's this line between, am I sensitive or is EMF just messing with, right? Because like in a certain sense, all of us are electrosensitive, and it's just about what threshold. And the reason I'm saying that is because tinnitus is a condition linked to EMF exposure by U.S. military research going back to the 1960s. It's actually called the Frey Effect, Frey, and this is published, peer-reviewed, replicated science that shows that EMF exposure in the wireless range can trigger tinnitus and other auditory effects and hallucinations. And so you don't need to be particularly sensitive in order to have that particular condition. There are other symptoms of EHS which are harder to link by the science, but tinnitus is one that has been demonstrated by science for over half a century.
Right, right. Yeah, people have certain ideas about what sensitivity means, right?
Yeah.
What does it really mean? Sometimes people ask me, well, how is it that I could even possibly have celiac disease? I don't have any gut symptoms, because I said that the number one cause of osteoporosis at a young age is celiac disease. And
Oh,
no one ever thinks of that to look for that, and so it's interesting that people always assume that a certain condition has very specific symptoms only for that condition, and anything else is not part of it,
yeah.
so
No, for sure. I mean, so we talk about anxiety being one of the outcomes of these exposures. If someone's walking around with, and sleep disruption. So if someone's walking around feeling like I'm not getting enough sleep, I'm a little anxious. I'm too anxious, and the anxiety is hurting my sleep. The bad sleep is making my anxiety worse, and goes back.
right.
And they're not thinking, well, maybe I should be using my cell phone less and unplugging my Wi-Fi. They don't think that, right? So they may not even be fully aware of what they're experiencing, and even if they are, they're not going to necessarily think, well, the EMF exposure is obviously the cause. And
Yes.
so you have a lot of this undiagnosed electrosensitivity in the population.
Yes, which is
Um,
why we're talking about
yeah,
it.
but
It just
if I'm
requires an index of suspicion.
yeah.
Yeah, so you were going to say something else.
Yeah, well, I know we're focusing on EMF, and I'm happy to continue focusing on EMF. I just want to throw in there that there are numerous negative health effects linked to our relationships with our cell phones, with our social media. This is an increasingly well researched area
Mhm.
of science and health, and at a certain point, it can be difficult to kind of separate out what's being caused by our relationship with Facebook or Instagram versus what's being caused by the EMF exposure that we're getting as a result of our addiction to Facebook and Instagram.
Right.
But there, and one article from Psychology Today that I like citing to help demonstrate this point is that sleeping in the same room as your phone, even if your phone is fully powered off, can negatively impact your sleep. And that has to do with our psychological relationship with the device, the anticipatory reflexes that are going on in our biology. And so it's important, I think, for people. And again, I'm happy to keep talking about EMF because that's where I like educating
Right.
people. But it's
Right.
important for people to understand that it's not just the EMF that are causes of these mental health issues that we are seeing. And sometimes it can actually be difficult to kind of tease apart what's being caused by the EMF and what's being caused by all of the relationships and platforms and experiences that we're getting exposed to EMF through.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy you brought that up. Really happy because it is not black and white. There's a lot of layers, there's subtleties, there's nuances, and everybody's different, right? So it is figuring that out. And I think the way to start figuring that out is to be curious about it and to start, eliminating those things, to ask yourself those very questions and
Hmm.
start eliminating those possibilities one by one. And every so often I do have a friend who's saying, I'm gonna get off Facebook, I'm gonna be off the social media, and then if that doesn't, and you get a sense of how much your anxiety or your sleep disturbance changes, and then you might want to take the next step of moving your phone downstairs
Hmm.
so you're not picking it up the moment that the moment you wake up, and using other alternatives for waking up, like actually getting a real alarm clock.
Yeah.
Actually getting a real alarm clock on your desktop, that or plugging it in, getting one of those wind up ones,
Yeah.
right?
You want a battery operated one or a wind up one, not a plug in one. But yeah.
Right, right. I mean, if you really want to go to that degree. But yeah, there's different levels of trying different things and trying to, figure that out.
Hmm.
And it is having that index of suspicion, but at the same time, there's going to be a lot of overlap with those other things like heavy metals and mold and all these other issues that we investigate. one of the ways, what are some of the things that people can do to sort of figure that out for themselves besides what I mentioned? How do people figure that out for themselves to say where they raise that issue to a higher level, a higher priority?
Um, that is a so. I'm trying to think about the best way to answer that question. I think um, so.
While you're thinking about it, what I notice in my patients is that when they leave their home, go on vacation, they feel so much better.
Yeah.
There's so many things that I think of. Okay, reduce stress, unless it's a working vacation, but mold in their home, right? There's just less distractions. There's so many.
So yeah, to
Yeah.
see some of these, so because there's the things that you can do that have the most impact on your EMF exposure, but you're asking something a little different, although very related. And so what I would say, which is if you want to see if this stuff really is impacting you, the the first thing I would do is to make sure you're not sleeping with your phone. So make sure you put it into airplane mode and you keep it out of the bedroom. And if you don't feel better, I would be very surprised. And I'm talking about in 1 or 2 nights.
Mm.
Um, on my podcast, because I don't use an Aura ring myself, but on my podcast, the Healthier Tech podcast, I had on this. Well, he's basically a Superman, but he runs a digital detox retreat in Bali, and he uses an Aura ring, and he learned about EMF, and he decided to start turning off his Wi-Fi router at night. So he didn't abandon Wi-Fi. He didn't switch over to fully wired internet, but he just started turning it off at night. And that first night and consistently every night, because again, he has this Aura ring, he was able to see that he immediately got 15 minutes more of deep sleep every night just as a result of turning off his router.
Mm.
Your sleep quality will improve if you are sleeping with your phone. Your sleep quality will improve if you keep it out of the bedroom and turn it off. And that's a great way to see if this kind of force is impacting you.
Yeah. So out of the bedroom completely, not even just 6 feet away.
Well, as far away as possible, but in order to get, so 6 feet away is better than 1 foot away, and it's
Right.
certainly better than under your pillow. But I recommend, again, because like I said earlier, just having your phone in the bedroom at all
Right.
will negatively impact your sleep.
Right.
And so another example I'll give of this, and this is more about mental health and EMF exposure. But I learned within the past year that if I'm watching Netflix on TV in my living room,
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy it more and I engage with the content more if I cannot see my phone.
Hmm.
If I can see my phone, or if I know that it's just on the counter over there, I'm always kind of being drawn to it. And I don't use social media.
Right.
But I noticed that in myself. I'm not saying the same is going to be true for everybody, but I believe that a lot of people will experience that as well. That just by moving the phone to where you can't see it and you're not actively thinking about it, you're going to have better, deeper, more valuable experiences. And when it comes to your sleep, that's a very important experience.
Yeah.
So that's where I would recommend. If someone suspects that they're actually sensitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
The best thing to do. There's two things I recommend in those instances. One is to like you said, get away for a little while. Go away for 3 days to a low EMF area. Get a cabin in the woods, or even out in a small town compared to the big city. Go to a lower EMF area for a few days and see if the symptoms you suspect are attributable to EMF exposure, if they start being alleviated.
Mm-hmm.
That is a good test. The other that I recommend is actually learning how to test EMF.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole bunch of meters. I recommend them. I don't make or sell them. So I evaluate ones that are consumer grade, but still good, right? Because if you looked on Amazon, you can find a $20 meter and a $30 meter, and those are junk. What you need to be willing to spend is about $160, $180 and get a decent meter that is relatively accurate, and start taking measurements and you can compare it against because this stuff is invisible and it's odorless and it's tasteless. There's no way of sensing like it. So if you're standing next to an active Wi-Fi router, you can guess that there's going to be some high levels. But
Right.
there's a lot of instances where you won't know because it'll have to do with the wiring in the wall or something your neighbor has on the other side of the wall that you've never seen,
Right.
or a cell tower that went up a mile away recently that you had no idea about. And the only way to tell what those levels are is with a decent meter. And
Right.
so I'm a big advocate of learning, of getting a decent meter and learning how to test, and then comparing those levels to published guidelines from places like the Building Biology Institute.
Right. And I think mentioned to you about a patient who realized that her apartment was next to a bank of smart meters in the apartment complex, right?
Yeah.
And she didn't really realize it until she had this index of suspicion, right, about it, and really looked for it, searched for it, and then she
Yeah.
moved away from it and felt a lot better. So,
Yeah, and smart meter. So a bank of smart meters is a bank of power meters at all is not going to be healthy because, as I mentioned, there's the power line frequency. Smart meters got a lot of attention, but even traditional meters, non-wireless, dumb analog meters, these have very high levels of the power line frequency EMF running through them. And so if you put a bank of them together, you have very high levels. And then if they're smart on top of it, each one is basically a mini cell tower in addition to what I was just talking about. And those can have just incredibly high exposure levels.
yeah, really, really toxic. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. We actually are looking for a new office because our office flooded. And one of the offices that I found, it was beautiful space, good space, doable. But I opened a closet door and there was all of these meters. There was
Oh
like
man.
40 of them
Oh my.
right in the closet. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
I always like when I bought my house, I always bring a meter with me.
Mhm. Mhm.
I once passed on a I've actually no a few times passed on when I was searching properties, both when I was renting and now, based off of the meter readings. And sometimes it can be you just won't know it. Like I helped someone do some basic testing. I am not an expert tester, but I know how to do the basics.
Mhm.
And I was helping this person, and they just had tremendous levels of magnetic EMF. So it's a kind of power line
Mhm.
radiation. And I was using the meter. I tracked it down, and it's coming. In their case, it was coming from the power line across the street, not the power line that serviced their house, but the power line across the street. And the one that was servicing their house had much lower levels. So the one that was further away was actually the much bigger source. And in their case, there's basically nothing that they could do about it, because that would be the responsibility of the power company to fix. And that type of force is very hard to shield against because you would need to shield like the entire home.
Right.
And so, but you wouldn't know it unless you were testing.
Right. Oh, wow. It's something that people have to be wary of, just like you would be with carbon monoxide and radon, right? It's just one
Yeah.
more thing to have on the list to look into.
But in this case, right, I mean, when it comes to things like I just described, it is out of your control. But in a lot of ways, with a lot of these exposures, they are actually in our control. So we talked earlier about how much these exposures are growing, and they
Mhm.
are. That is for sure. But despite that, it's often what you do with the tech that is closest to you that can
Mhm.
have the biggest impact on your exposure.
Mhm.
And the example I always give, it's my number one tip for people, is to stop carrying their phone in their pockets
Mhm.
or to put it into airplane mode if you do. Because when you put it into airplane mode, you're essentially cutting out all the EMF emissions.
Mm.
Um, and the reason, right? Because the cell phone, it's a very powerful device, but it's not the most powerful device you're exposed to, right?
Mhm.
Cell tower is much more powerful than the cell phone.
Mhm.
In some cases, your Wi-Fi router might be more powerful than your cell phone. So why is the cell phone so important? Because the power of EMF radiation diminishes exponentially with distance, right?
Mhm.
So if you have a phone and it's 1 inch away from your body, and then you take it and now it's 2 inches away from your body, you've cut the power of that exposure by 75%.
Wow.
If you then double that again to 4 inches, you cut it by another 75%. Conversely, when it's when it's in your pocket, it's right up against your body, you are getting a maximal possible dose of radiation from this thing, keeping in mind that the cell phone itself is designed to be able to transmit signals over miles to the cell towers. Sometimes are that far away. But then it isn't just that, right? Because you also have Wi-Fi, you also have Bluetooth, you also have NFC or near field communication, which is what Apple Pay and Google Pay work off of. So you actually have multiple radio cards in here. So it's not even just the cell phone, and it's up against your body, and generally for hours at a time, for almost every day. And so that's why I point out this specific exposure. So that's why, and I use it as an example, I believe that in many cases, it is the largest dose of radiation that people are exposed to in their lives because of the way, the characteristics of the exposure that I just explained.
Right.
So stopping to carry your phone in your pocket or your bra during workouts, ladies, or putting it into airplane mode, that is the number one tip that I have for people.
That's great. That's great. We don't have much time left, but if there's any other tips that you can just rattle off right now.
Sure, I will. Yeah. And I'd also, we have on the top of my, if you visit shieldyourbody.com, at the very top, there's a link to just get the ebook. And the ebook has my top tips and the science behind the top tips. But very quickly, just same reason you shouldn't carry your carry your phone in your pocket. You shouldn't use your laptop in your lap. You should never use Bluetooth headsets. You should not sleep with your phone. These are some of the top things that I would say. And in general, I break it down into what I call the 2 key rules, which is to minimize your use of this technology and to maximize the distance between the tech and your body when you do use it. So minimizing use would be, for instance, turning off your Wi-Fi router at night and putting your phone into airplane mode when you're not using it. And maximizing distance would be keeping your phone out of the bedroom, working with your laptop on a desk instead of on your lap. Any source of EMF, you want to minimize your use of it and maximize the distance between it and your body when you are using it.
Right. And reducing use of cordless things too, I would
Yes.
imagine too. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. You have given us a wealth of information. I hope people are convinced by this conversation that they really should do something to reduce their exposure and distance, increase their distance from these devices, despite how much we need them in our lives now. And if you don't need it, then just get rid of it.
Yeah.
Right?
I actually, I'll just say one more quick thing. Because I know when people hear this, it can kind of be terrifying because we're talking about a dangerous invisible force and it's coming off of all of these places. So I just want to assure your listeners, the goal is not and should never be to have zero EMF exposure, because that is a completely unrealistic goal in the modern world. And it's about eliminating the extraneous exposures that don't add sufficient value to your life or that are purely optional. And that's where you should be focusing your reduction efforts.
Fabulous point. That's an excellent point. And I think you're right. You don't want to make your world smaller. The other thing you can do is really increase your health and increase your boundaries just by improving, if you have increased gut permeability, just by doing that, removing mold, removing the heavy metals, which increases the intensity of these waves, that's really strengthening your immune system, and creating boundaries on a cellular level is really going to be as important as doing these things. I love the way that you phrased that. We don't want people to leave this episode afraid. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, you have control. You have a lot of power over this situation, and your goal should not be zero EMF exposure. It should be reducing where you can.
Right, right. So now, can you tell the audience where people can find you? I know you mentioned your website, shieldyourbody.com. And are you anywhere else where if they're
Yeah, I'd also ask all of your listeners to consider subscribing to the Healthier Tech podcast, where we talk about issues related to EMF, but also about all issues related to our relationship with modern technology,
Mhm.
addiction, anxiety, pollution, anything related to our relationships with modern technology, which is a really interesting and deep area, subject matter area. So that's the Healthier Tech podcast. We're on all the podcasting platforms and at healthiertech.co.
Yeah, and all of that will be in the show notes, and we'll even have a link to your website where they can download that free guide to reduce the EMFs.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you too. I really appreciate it. Everybody. Yay.
Yeah.
This is great. I've been wanting so much to talk to you about all of this and to give people sort of a really nice leg up in the right direction on this matter.
Thank you very much.